Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're just waiting for everyone to kind of come into the Zoom. And thank you for your patience while we just took like an extra minute there with some organizational stuff. But yeah, looks like we're getting a good list in here. We will get started in just about another minute. I'm here with Jane Oneail, and while we're waiting for everyone to kind of come into the room, I just wanted to get started with a few quick announcements. As many of you know, we have been asking people to vote for our One Book Chelmsford 2022 title. We have 4 titles on the ballot. This is your last week to vote. So we have Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. We have There by Tommy Orange. We have On Earth You're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and Kindred by Octavia Butler. So very different titles, but honestly, don't think you could go wrong with any of those. We're really interested in creating a lot of great discussions and programming around those titles. So make sure you get your vote in online on our website, Facebook, in person, in the library. There's ballot box there at the circulation desk where you can vote, okay? The other thing I wanted to announce is that we do have another Watch It Wednesdays coming up on October 27th. We've kind of revamped our film watching and discussion series in conjunction with the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committee in Chelmsford. We're going to be watching Fruitvale Station. It's about 80 minutes long, starting at 6:30 on Wednesday, and then we're going to have a discussion afterwards, hosted by the DEI, Chelmsford DEI Committee. Then on Thursday, we have a special event in conjunction with the Memorial Hall Library in Andover, the heirloom gardener, John Forty. John Forty is an historian and ethnobotanist who has directed gardens for Plymouth Plantation Museum, Strawberry Bank Museum, Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and Bedrock Gardens. And he is very into biodiversity and native and heirloom plants and artisanal practices. And I think that that's a really, really great program for anyone who's interested in gardening and preserving local spaces. There will also be an opportunity for you to buy his book at a discount in conjunction with this program. Next, we have, for any of you art lovers who'd like to try your own hand at it, we have both a virtual art class on bird drawing, hosted by Barbara Freiberg, who has a degree in studio art from the University of Binghamton and 17 years experience. She's going to walk you step by step through the process of drawing a bird. And you can, and a lot of the materials are things you can find at home. So she doesn't require any special materials. We also have a pastel painting workshop coming up on Tuesday, November 16th, starting at 6:30 p.m. And that's with Greg Maychek. And a lot of people know Greg Maychek. He's been with us for years now. And he's from Holyoke, Massachusetts. He's a portrait artist, a specialist in pastels. And he's going to walk you through the process to make a painting that's reminiscent of Millet's elegant dandelions. And then finally, just want to let you know, we have like an amazing audience already, but we hope to have more for local university professor Dr. Christoph Strobel is going to present Beyond the Mayflower in 1620, Native Americans of New England. And it's going to kind of reveal a little bit of the truth behind the history of the Pilgrims and their relationship with the Native Americans that were already here in New England, and a lot of colonization, dispossession, and racism, and the impact that had on the indigenous people of New England. So that is on Thursday, November 4th, next week, starting at 7 p.m. Anyway, so now let's get to tonight's program. Tonight, we welcome back Jane Oneail. We are so fortunate that she keeps coming online with us. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held a role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her organization is Culturally Curious. Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. And you can learn more about her organization at iamculturallycurious.com. Tonight, she's going to cover the Wyeths, an American artistic dynasty. And we were just kind of thinking about the fact that one of Christina Baker Klein's most recent historical novels was focused on that painting that's in Jane's opening slide, Christina's World. And I'm sure that many of I know that this was there's a big holds list for that one, so I'm sure many of our audience has read it, but many may not know that the Wyeth family of artists is known for their somber realism and subtle storytelling, and this program will explore the style of painting and illustration established by N.C. Wyeth in the early 1900s and passed on and reinterpreted by his children, primarily Andrew Wyeth and his grandson Jamie Wyeth. Tonight we'll learn more about their favorite subjects, their influences, and their enduring impact in the art world. And tonight we are presenting this in a webinar format. So if you have any questions, please send them to the chat or use the Q&A module, and we will read them after the program. So thank you so much, Jane, for joining us again tonight.
It's my pleasure, Jess. Thank you so much. I'm so glad everybody could join us tonight. Since I can't see your faces, please feel free to write anything in the chat along the way, because I'd love to have some sense of personal connection with you, even though we're doing this virtually. So once again, thank you for joining us. This will be a treat. I think everybody loves the Wyeths. You can't help but love the Wyeths. So what we're going to do tonight is look at 3 generations of an artistic family that has a tremendous amount of impact on American art and culture. So we're going to focus on primarily 3 artists and consider the connecting thread between them and how, despite that, they were sort of able to stake out their own unique perspectives, despite the fact that they had almost identical training and they all spent almost their entire lives in the exact same place. So lots to get through. So let's just dive right in. Oh, and of course, I should mention, we will get back to Christina's World without a doubt. We'll spend a lot of time with this picture. But to get us going tonight, our overview for the program, there's not a lot of extraneous stuff. We're going to be meeting the family. We'll focus on N.C. Wyeth, the patriarch. We'll look at the 2nd generation because he had a number of artistic children, but we'll zero in on Andrew Wyeth, his son. This is N.C. up here with Andrew Wyeth. And then Andrew Wyeth's son, Jamie. This is Andrew as an older gentleman with Jamie Wyeth in a more recent photograph. So that gives us sort of an idea of what we'll be covering. There isn't a big final conclusion at the end because there's so much to cover, but we will kind of connect all the dots. All right, so the Wyeth family, just to give you a sense in terms of who they are, we have Newell Converse Wyeth. That's what the NC stands for. And here he is in a photograph over here. He and his wife, Carolyn, had 5 children that survived into adulthood. So we'll meet them all briefly after getting to know Newell Converse himself. And then we'll go further down this line with Andrew and Jamie Wyeth. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of N.C. Wyeth's kind of approach to his family, his outlook on his family. When he was still a young man, one of his painting instructors was the patriarch of a large family himself. He had 5 or 6 kids. And while N.C. Wyeth was studying with this man, they all took a break for lunch one day, and he saw his painting instructor sit underneath a great big tree with his wife and his 5 or 6 kids. And it was like at that moment, N.C. Wyeth decided that was what he wanted for himself. He even wrote home to his mother about it. So it's pretty wonderful that that was what he was able to accomplish. And even more amazing that he was able to kind of instill or cultivate these talents in his own children. So parenting was a major preoccupation in his life, and also the arts, of course. All right, so let's zoom in on Newell Converse Wyeth. I'll just refer to him as N.C. Wyeth. We're on a first name basis. All right, so here is another photograph of N.C. Wyeth. Now, he was born in 1882, so he sort of comes of age right around the turn of the century, and he dies in 1945, right around the end of the Second World War, and it was just days before his 63rd birthday, so he was relatively young when he died. He grew up in Needham, Massachusetts. He received sort of the best artistic training you could get as a young man who was growing up on the outskirts of Boston. His family was kind of connected to arts and culture in a certain way, and he attended what is now the Mass College of Art and Design. And it was there that a professor recommended to him that he should go into illustration. It wasn't necessarily his driving mission before he attended school there. So in 1902, when N.C. Wyeth was about 24, 25 years old, he went to the Brandywine River Valley in southeastern Pennsylvania to study specifically with this great illustrator named Howard Pyle. And it was Howard Pyle whose life he was sort of emulating later on with all the kids. Howard Pyle, like I said, he was like at the top of his game illustration wise. And Pyle led classes that were extremely competitive to get in on, but once you were there, you could attend for free. So it was like a great group to sort of be associated with. When I say that they were competitive too, within a few years of N.C. Wyeth joining classes there, they'd get about 300 applicants a year and accept maybe 2 or 3 of them. So very competitive. And probably for that reason, N.C. Wyeth as a young man was feeling like he had a lot of confidence, let's put it that way. Here he is in a photograph in his studio around 1903, right around the time he decided to submit a painting for consideration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And you can see over here on the right, he was selected. Now, this is a huge deal in the life of an artist. There were, hundreds of artists that submitted works for consideration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post that never succeeded. And here he is, this young man, full of promise, but also confidence, clearly. So he succeeds in this realm, and he earns enough money and enough confidence from the Saturday Evening Post that they want to kind of send him out west, because he's kind of mastered this Western style, this unique American subject matter that they thought he showed a lot of promise with. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show you here is that the Saturday Evening Post didn't publish his entire image. The original painting looks like this. The hat has been omitted, right? But we've got the bucking bronco here and the cowboy who's maintaining his place on the horse's back with his kind of switch raised in the air. There's so much life and vigor to this moment. It's actually a moment that, if you think about it, it's pretty remarkable that an artist could kind of freeze this moment in their head before before you could hit pause on a video. It's a really striking moment. But the hat is something I want you to keep in mind throughout the program tonight. Look at the tension it creates just with the edge of the picture frame here. You don't actually see a lot of artists using space in this way. It's really interesting to me, and I think this will be one of the threads that you see that sort of connects with some of his progeny. All right, so he becomes this sort of specialist in the Western subject matter. He leaves the Northeast, he travels to the Southwest, he sort of plays at being a cowboy. He starts like acquiring all of these props and you know, models in some cases for his Western subject matter. And this was something he was completely immersed in. He was in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and so he becomes known really as like this painter of Western life and of outdoor life. Here we see another successful picture that he submitted to the Saturday Evening Post for a cover. And, you know, it's 1907 at this point. It's not like America was filled with cowboys, but he is capitalizing on this kind of romantic notion of the American cowboy, and maybe even like it's the idea of like the setting sun on this romantic notion of the American cowboy. So we've got this dramatic silhouette here with this huge orange blazing sun in the background, set against this cowboy with the huge mustache and the huge hat and the huge handkerchief, who looks very like macho, very manly. It's a very traditional notion of strength. I think it's sort of funny that in just a few decades, Norman Rockwell is, I think, specifically making fun of this notion of cowboy, American cowboy and masculinity, because Norman Rockwell makes the hat even bigger, the mustache bigger, the handkerchief bigger, and we can see this cowboy is, you know, leaning into the old songs and just kind of reminiscing about what it was like to be a cowboy by 1927. So N.C. Wyeth becomes well, like I said, he really immerses himself in this Western subject matter, and he becomes fairly well known for creating these beautiful depictions of Native Americans. They're usually solitary figures. We've got the 1908 cover here on the left, and then the picture on the right is called Into the Crystal Deep, I believe. Yes, Into the Crystal Depths. Now, I was really kind of struck by these images, and I was just kind of like digging around on the internet a few weeks back, and I read this one critic's take on these images in relation to the fact that N.C. Wyeth didn't really paint pictures of people who weren't sort of white. And his reaction to this really just sort of hit me in the gut. And I'm just going to share this one critic's take on this. His name is Philip Kennicott. And he wrote, but racial homogeneity is rarely an accident and often achieved at a terrible cost. The romanticizing of Native Americans at the end of the 19th century was a direct result of decades of war, displacement, and genocide, to the point that they came to seem safely remote from American life, a fading echo of a bygone past. They could exist in Wyatt's paintings because they no longer existed in his reality, which I think speaks a lot to how Americans treated and sort of conceived of Native Americans at this point in history. So N.C. Wyeth continues to be quite successful as a young man. According to Outing magazine in 1907, he was our greatest, if not the greatest, painter of American outdoor life. This is his picture for a Western novel called The Little Posse Started Out on Its Journey, also from 1907. So he's got the horses down, he's got this sense of American cowboy toughness down pat. Now, in his first 17 years as an illustrator, roughly from 1903 to about 1919, N.C. Wyeth created 561 illustrations for almost 275 different periodicals. That's pretty impressive. So let's take a look at how things begin to change for him beyond just the periodicals. It's perhaps his book illustrations that really launch his career. So in total, he illustrates 112 books over the course of his career, and 25 of them are for Scribners. They're like the Scribners classics, like the one that we see here for Treasure Island. He would create usually about 15 to 20 full-size paintings that were then, those images were integrated into the text. And these images I can't emphasize enough how important they were. These images existed before television. So as young people are consuming these stories and this text, they had the opportunity to really like inhale these images. These images help them conceive of what these stories were all about. So we have the cover of Treasure Island over here. This dates to 1911. The book itself was written in 1883. So this is like a new printing of Treasure Island. And we can see his notion of what pirates look like here, which has greatly informed our modern notion of what pirates look like. The Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp's character like would not have existed without N.C. Wyeth. And I love this image over here on the right because you get a sense of how large these pictures actually were, and then of course scaled down for purposes of publication. Just to give you a sense in terms of what these illustrations for the text look like. Over here on the left, we have an image that's called One More Step, Mr. Hands. Now this is a very dramatic, almost like a climactic scene where you have this fight on the ship. Jim Hawkins, our protagonist here, has 2 guns in his hands, and he's saying to this pirate, like, one more step and I'll blow you away. So we've got all of this kind of dramatic diagonals in the rigging here, and even in the arm of this pirate whose knife is kind of reaching out into our space almost. We sense the danger here. And of course, the fact that it's illustrating that line of text tells us that this is, such an important moment. Over here, we have the hostage. We have Jim Hawkins, who is being tied up and sort of dragged along by Long John Silver. Again, it's our modern notion of a pirate with the parrot on his shoulder and the one leg. And so all of this is kind of coming to life because of N.C. Wyeth. Now I want to show you how his images sort of expand upon the text in a really wonderful way. This is a picture where Jim Hawkins, our protagonist, decides to leave home. And the line of text that this is illustrating is simply, I said goodbye to my mother and the cove. But look at the information Wyeth is giving us about that departure, about that goodbye, the sorrow in the mother's posture here, his determination to set out on this adventure. There's so much more to this image than that simple line of text. So we can see how N.C. Wyeth's images can add so much to the original text. Now, because he sold these 17 paintings for Treasure Island, he earned a great deal of money from that, enough money that he could afford his home and build his studio in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. All of this happened before the age of 30. And of course, this was the home that he raised his 5 children in. It's on 18 acres of land. So as a young artist, illustrating books was a very good moneymaker for him. And interestingly enough, it was not necessarily the field that he wanted to be in, but we'll sort of touch upon that in a little bit. I wanted to show you the inside of this studio over here, which essentially remains untouched in many ways since Wyatts' death. But we get the sense of, this expansive space that he had in order to, in some cases, make huge murals and some of the props and that sort of thing that he collected for his images. All right, so I wanted to show you just a few more examples of his illustrations for books here. And this is from The Boys King Arthur over here on the left. This is from The Last of the Mohicans over here on the right. These are like climactic, violent scenes. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to share with you just what we're looking at over here on the left is a joust scene, and you can see that one lance has hit a rider and the other one has split. Now, this is a weird sort of personal anecdote, but when I met my husband, he had been jousting around the world. And he was on a reality TV show called Full Metal Jousting, where one of their challenges in terms of telling the story of jousting on TV was that it all happened way too fast. You almost couldn't see, it's almost like hockey, like you can't really see what happens. So they had to slow down the footage in order to show like who hit where and the lances breaking and all that sort of thing. And as I look at this, I just think it's amazing that N.C. Wyeth back in 1917 could, in his mind, freeze frame this incredible image and tell the story this way, in a way that is like so engaging. So he really did have a special talent for telling these dramatic stories. But then we also see it wasn't just violence that he could do really well. This is another scene from The Boys King Arthur, when King Arthur receives the sword, the Excalibur. And I just think that this is like a stunning image. It's very cinematic. It seems like something from almost like a Lord of the Rings movie. So we see that we're in a boat on water, but we don't see the horizon line. It's like this misty space that we're in. The swans are flying. It gives us a sense of movement. And then this disembodied hand comes out of the water, offering up the sword to King Arthur over here, who's accompanied by Merlin. I mean, it is incredible. And again, it's so expansive upon the text, which simply reads, and when they came to the sword that the hand held, King Arthur took it up. This is such an incredible image to go along with that. Now, I mentioned before, this wasn't necessarily the field that N.C. Wyeth wanted to be in. He was someone who really aspired to be a fine art artist. He was sort of sick of illustrations and working for commissions in that way. It's interesting because I always was way more familiar with Rockwell, and always kind of surprised that so many people asked me, was Rockwell okay with being an illustrator? And yes, he was. That was his field. But it was N.C. Wyeth who just, you know, it just chafed in some way. He wanted more. And so this is a look at him kind of dabbling in the fine arts. This sort of looks like an American Impressionist painting to me. It's called Buttonwood Farm. It's a depiction of a farm right near where he lived. This is from 1920. So he's sort of going in and out of illustration and fine art here. But we've got, you know, the broken visible brushstrokes in the sky, in the trees here, and in the foreground. The very light sort of pastel palette here. It's a beautiful picture. It was celebrated when he created it, but it's really not the kind of thing that he became known for. One of, I think, his best pictures, one picture that I just love, sort of seems to be a little bit of a mix of both of these things, illustration and the fine arts. This was a picture that he created in homage to one of his own students. He was teaching young artists in the same way that he had been taught. And one of his students had died early. I believe it was from tuberculosis. But in the same way that N.C. Wyeth aspired to be like his own mentor, this young man had really aspired to be like N.C. Wyeth. They had a connection. And so N.C. Wyeth created this remarkable image of a giant sort of stomping through the ocean here up in the clouds. And this is simply called The Giant from 1923. But with the children on the beach in the foreground, who all seem to be captivated by this image, we realize that, of course, the giant is like their shared fantasy, their shared imaginative story. And in this picture, N.C. Wyeth shows us his own 5 children over here, from the standing girl to the children, to the child on the right. And it's this young boy over here with the white hat that is meant to stand in as his student, who was really sort of simpatico in this kind of approach to painting and approach to life. So such a wonderful picture here that really speaks to, you know, how children think and play. So N.C. Wyeth, because he aspired to greater things, thought a lot about the American master Winslow Homer. He was a 19th century painter who was really celebrated for his depictions of the Maine coast. Now, N.C. Wyeth in 1936, in 1920, bought a summer house in the mid-coast of Maine, and he actually named it 8 Bells, which is the name of this Winslow Homer painting that's over here on the left. So it's like he's just telegraphing to the world, this is what I want to be. I want to be the next Winslow Homer. His painting of 8 Bells, of course, doesn't have any of the mystery or the drama of the original painting that I believe is at the Addison Gallery over at Phillips Academy in Andover. So, Winslow Homer is somebody who, told these dramatic pictures about like man versus nature and that sort of thing. And that wasn't really what N.C. Wyeth was well known for. But at least here we have a good sense of what his home in Port Clyde, Maine looked like. All right, so now that he's spending his summers in Maine, N.C. Wyeth begins to create more images of the water, of the Maine shoreline. And I think that this is one of his most interesting images from this time. This is a picture that was completed in 1939, and it's called Island Funeral. I love it because we're sort of hovering up above this island, and we're seeing all of these funeral goers come in by boat and sort of bringing their boats ashore and then filing into this building where the funeral's happening. There's something about this bird's eye view hovering above that it almost makes me feel as though the deceased, their soul has departed, and they're looking down at all of the people that have come to pay their respects. But there's a lot about this picture, the way that it's conceived, this bird's eye view, that's very similar to the way that regionalist painters were creating works. And regionalist painters were artists like Grant Wood of American Gothic with the pitchfork, and Thomas Hart Benton, who are best known for creating works of the American Midwest, farmland scenes. So here's one of these bird's eye view scenes with these kind of gently rolling hills and almost cartoon-like trees over here. There's something just a little bit cartoony about N.C. Wyeth's picture over here. Now, he had created this image in particular and I should mention that this is Grant Wood's painting called Young Corn from 1931. So it's a little bit earlier than Wyatt's Island Funeral. So he'd created this picture to be a part of his first one-man show in a New York City gallery called the Macbeth Gallery. And I wouldn't say he failed miserably at this one-man show, but he only sold 2 paintings. And that would seem like failing miserably because at this point in his life, his son Andrew was already selling out shows at that same gallery. So you can imagine poor N.C. Wyeth, who's just, striving for achieving so much more. Here he is with that same painting in the background. He's just not quite hitting the mark of what he's aiming for. Now let's take a look at his painting, The Lobstermen, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So in some ways that sort of consecrates this as like N.C. Wyeth's most important painting. This is from 1944. Now, very somber colors here. We don't get like some of that brilliant blue sky that he's pretty well known for. We just see this one lobsterman in profile. He almost seems as though he's standing up to navigate this little boat amongst these choppy waves. It's kind of a heroic picture. We get a sense of movement here, but in the end, it's not quite what Winslow Homer was painting. So Winslow Homer, the artist that N.C. Wyeth aspired to be, was all about man versus nature, anonymous fishermen who are, precariously counterbalancing the weight of, the herring net here being pulled into the boat and leaning over. Instead, this almost seems like a commercial for lobstering or something like that, or for rowboats for that matter. We don't even see any lobsters here. So the weather here is scary and precarious. The work here is scary and precarious. Here, this is like almost like an image of strength and vigor. So I would say that it's more closely related to, again, what the regionalist artists were doing at this time. This is Thomas Hart Benton's painting called Cut the Line from the same year that The Lobstermen was created. Thomas Hart Benton, this regionalist artist, secured this huge commission through the US military to create a number of images about the Navy in this case. And you can see he creates these figures that have these very expressive poses and these kind of undulating forms here. Look at, I mean, how the body just sort of ripples this way. And I sort of get the same sense of movement in the figure, that same kind of lunge in N.C. Wyatt's picture, and the same kind of muted colors. So I think he was more in line with these regionalist artists than with Winslow Homer in this case. All right, so right around the time of World War II, we have N.C. Wyeth contributing to the war effort with posters. And this is sort of going back to his illustration roots in this case, and taking all of that wisdom that he gained by creating those battle scenes from The Boy's King Arthur and from The Last of the Mohicans to create an epic battle scene in this poster with, you know, the lines of planes in the sky, the men, the infantry coming forward with, you know, bayonets on their rifles, and then a very dramatic Uncle Sam pointing out into the distance, but really at all of us to buy war bonds. It's a great image. It's a great image. It's an illustration for sure, not a fine art picture per se. So we're going to wrap up with the end of N.C. Wyatt's life here, and it ended right around the end of the World War II. So this is one of his final self-portraits. This was painted just a few years before in 1940. So it gives us a sense in terms of what he looked like, who he was around this time. The image over here are photographs of his daughter-in-law and his 4-year-old grandson. So N.C. Wyeth met a really tragic end that's related to his grandson and an automobile ride. So he would regularly take his grandson, his namesake, out for rides in the car to run errands around Chadds Ford. And on a particular day, he apparently stalled out on the train tracks at the exact time that the one train that ran through town on these train tracks was coming, and they couldn't get out of the car or move the car in time, and they met their end in this very tragic way. But there was a lot of speculation about what could have happened there, what really happened there. So I am one that always loves a little bit of salacious gossip, and I will give the caveat that that is exactly what this is. But there was some talk of the fact that perhaps he didn't stall out the car, that he chose not to move the car. There were witnesses there that said that they very clearly heard several blasts of the whistle from the train as it approached the car. So there was time in theory to get out. And there was other gossip that perhaps N.C. Wyeth had been having an affair with his daughter-in-law, and that perhaps his grandson was really his son. Of course, I can't speak to the truth of any of that, but I'll just throw it out there because it was part of the talk at the time. We will wrap up with N.C. Wyeth, thinking about him as the patriarch to this family. We're looking at a huge mural that he did that was roughly 60 feet long. Can you imagine painting a wall that big? So about 19 feet high, 60 feet long, and it's called The Apotheosis of the Family. So that is like the climax, the culmination, the crowning moment of the family. So we see a family right here at the center, and look at this. It's a family with 5 kids, 2 down here, 2 over here, and a babe in the mother's arms, and everything comes from this family. All of civilization, hunting, fishing, gathering, everything comes from this family that is, in essence, his family. So we see here a photograph of the artist up on a ladder in his studio. We can see how big this painting is relative to him. And again, another family photo over here with him and his children. So you can't really overemphasize how important his children were to his identity, to his legacy. And so let's meet a few of the next generation. Several of N.C. Wyeth's children became artists, and great artists in their own right. But of course, we all know one of them best, but I wanted to briefly introduce you to a few of them. His first daughter, who survived into adulthood, was Henriette Wyeth, and this is a photograph of her. Now, she's a pretty exceptional artist, a female artist too, and I mean, it bears noting that all of these, so many of his children could become artists because they were receiving training from one of the country's most beloved artists at the time. But Henriette had a disability in her hand that came from polio. So there was a particular challenge there, but she did study under her father. And then she even married an artist named Peter Hurd. And the two of them ultimately moved to the Southwest. They were the only members of the family that didn't stay right around Chadds Ford. So she had a great career in her own right. We're not going to spend too much time on her tonight, but she painted an official portrait of Pat Nixon that is in the White House today. I mean, I think that this is a fantastic portrait. If it had been painted 100 years earlier, you could have easily mistaken it by, for something painted by John Singer Sargent. It's beautiful. It's really well done. So there's probably a whole art talk waiting to happen just on Henriette Wyeth. The next in line is Carolyn Wyeth, who also studied under her father and also became a painter. She was married, but only for about 11 years. And so she was like the child that didn't really leave home. So she kind of took up the mantle of teaching art, particularly after her father's death. And a lot of her artwork focuses right on that land and the landscape right around Chadds Ford. So there's her parents' house, and in this picture that's called Up from the Woods from 1974, you can see just like a sliver of her parents' house, which I think she eventually moved back into. Next in line in the family lineage is N.C. Wyatt's first son, who was named N.C. Wyeth. And then I read that he legally changed his son's name to Nathaniel when he was 5 years old. And I thought, what is the story there? That seems like almost seems like disowning your child. But as it turns out, Nathaniel, when he was a baby, they used to put him out in a stroller in a sunroom to take a nap. And when they'd go and wake him up, or when he woke up, he always woke up with oily hands. And as it turns out, even as a baby, he was wheeling himself in his stroller before he fell asleep. And so N.C. Wyeth said, I'm not going to burden this young man with the name of an artist. I'll name him Nathaniel instead, after a family member who was an engineer. And lo and behold, Nathaniel Wyeth becomes a pretty celebrated, remarkable, incredibly talented and prolific engineer in his own right. I believe he had about 24 patents to his own name. He went off and worked for DuPont, and then his major claim to fame, although these days we probably don't think that this is such a great thing, he invented the plastic soda bottle, which is pretty remarkable. So in this little illustration, I don't know who did the illustration. It's fantastic. I found it in an article that was didn't credit the artist, unfortunately. We see the father with the paintbrush head and the son with the bow tie, and the plastic soda bottle head over here. But N.C. Wyeth was very proud of his son and said, it takes a lot of creativity to do the work that he does. Next in line was his daughter, Anne Wyeth. She was the musician in the family. So she played piano, and then later on in life, she actually began painting as well. But she became a pretty accomplished composer too. So as various family members had important events at the White House later on in life, Anne Wyeth was actually composing music for those events, which is pretty remarkable. So now we will turn our attention to the baby of the family, and that is Andrew Wyeth. And so we see him here in these great photographs of him as a young man. Now, he was born in 1917, and he's going to live all the way until 2009. And he is generally considered one of the leading painters, American painters of the 20th century. He doesn't get as much credit as a lot of other artists because he worked in realism. That was his style. But he was pretty innovative in terms of his materials and even his approach to his subject matter. He will go on to win so many medals. We don't have time, and awards and that sort of thing. We don't have time to cover all of them, but we'll get a good sense in terms of who he was. Now, he, as the youngest, he was in frail health, like so many of the artists that we've covered this year, you know, Andy Warhol and Frida Kahlo. They kind of grew up in frail health. They couldn't do traditional schooling. So their artistic side was nurtured by their parent. And in this case, his parent was already one of the most popular artists in the country. So that really worked to Andrew Wyeth's benefit. So let's turn our attention to what he does to distinguish himself from his father. Andrew Wyeth, at a very young age, becomes celebrated as more of a fine art artist than his father really ever was. And one of the ways he does that is he begins by working in media that his father was not known for. So his father's painting in oils, and Andrew Wyeth kind of launches a career painting in watercolors. And these are some of his early watercolors from around the age of 20. These are both depictions of Port Clyde, Maine. They were both a part of a show at the Macbeth Gallery that completely sold out. So just as a reminder, it's years later that NCY can only sell 2 paintings at the Macbeth Gallery. Now, this picture over here, I mean, the colors are beautiful. If you've done watercolors before, just the handling of the paint, I think, is really sort of spectacular here. But I want to compare for you these 2 images, which are both called the Lobstermen. The son's work is before the father's work. This is 37, this is 44. And you can see right off the bat that Andrew Wyeth, the son's work, is much more complicated. Here we just get the sort of straight profile celebratory image of a lobsterman. And here we've got this kind of complex wedge of waves here. We get this really kind of ambiguous view of a figure who's hunched over. There's just a lot more nuance to it. This is pretty straightforward in comparison. So Andrew Wyeth is being celebrated at a very young age. Here's a self-portrait he created in 1945. And it's a depiction of him right around Chad's Ford, walking through a field, probably with a portfolio in his arm here. And what we're looking at is a painting that's done in tempera paint. And he would do it in like the old school style with using egg yolks to create this kind of paint. Tempera paint tends to dry really sort of, it has a matte finish to it, whereas oil paint sort of glistens. So this was another good way to differentiate himself from his father. Apparently he and his wife would make meringues all the time to serve to their guests because they hated wasting the egg whites. But this is kind of a morose picture. There's this kind of haunting quality to it. It's dark. I want to draw your attention to this bird that is just hovering right by the horizon line there. And when I see that bird and the tension it creates, it reminds me of that hat from the bucking bronco that his father had painted, almost 40 years earlier for the Saturday Evening Post. And I do think that there's something from one generation to the next that understands or loves to explore this kind of interesting little tension that arises when you put things against a horizon line or against the edge of the picture this way. Now, it is this very same year that Andrew Wyeth loses his father, and that is when his style sort of crystallizes. We see his interest in tempera paint crystallizing. We see his approach to his subject matter crystallizing. So this color palette too becomes his dominant color palette. So this was painted the following year in 1946. You can only imagine how this man felt after losing not just his father, but his mentor in life and in art. How do you go on? So this is, so I should say that Andrew Wyeth committed himself to really staying right around Chad's Ford where he grew up, and going back to the same the same landscapes again and again and again. This was their neighbor's land that he painted so many times. And this is a picture that's called Winter. This is at the National Academy of Design. And it's a fantastic picture to kind of psychoanalyze, because we have the car tracks right here, over here. There's a lot of car tracks in Andrew Wyatt's pictures, and it's very easy to overanalyze that as being some sort of reference to his father and his father's death. Andrew Wyeth said, one of his greatest regrets in life was that he never painted a portrait of his father. In this case, we have a figure who seems to be sort of running down this hill, but almost looks as though they're in free fall. And you could imagine, to psychoanalyze again, that is perhaps how Andrew Wyeth felt at this point in his life and in his career. He actually, though, did talk about how this swell of the hill, notice that great tension it creates with the edge of the picture frame, that this swell reminded him of his father's chest when he breathed, and even when he slept, I think. So we see, consciously and maybe even subconsciously, these references to his father and his father's incredible impact on his career. So we continue to see these really muted colors, this commitment to realism in his work. This is a picture from the following year called Wind by the Sea. It's another tempera painting, so it has that kind of matte muted finish. I just love the way these lace curtains seem to sort of disintegrate in the middle of thin air and sort of dance here again. And once again, we can see the car tracks in the distance, this sense of maybe being trapped inside, to psychoanalyze. This is a picture that's at the National Gallery of Art in DC. So Wyeth is pretty committed to realism at this point, and to documenting, really, in some ways, the subject matter that was, right at his doorstep. And he began to paint the woman Anna Christina Olsen in this is an image from 1947. She was a woman who was 24 years older than him, and he had met her by way of the woman who would become his wife. He was first introduced to her at a time when he was really only interested in her property and the buildings on her property. He was really drawn to them, and he kind of used them as a studio for a while. And then she sort of began to creep in as subject matter in his works as well. So she becomes his most famous subject, but here she is sitting in the door frame, this wonderful play of light and shadow here, and the incredible sort of delineation of the wood grain on this like weathered door in the background, I think, is just so spectacular. And that, of course, brings us to Christina's World, his most famous picture. This is from 1948. It's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I heard, I don't know, some art historian or someone say that the two most frequently asked questions of the guards at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City was, one, where are the bathrooms? And two, where is Christina's World? Which says a lot, because at MoMA, I mean, you have these radically modern works and really well-loved works. You have Starry, Starry Night there, and Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. But this is a realist work which would stand out for so many reasons, and it's a very striking image. So let's dive into this work. So this is the owner of this kind of farm-like property up here, Anna Christina Olsen. And by now, most of you are probably familiar with her story, and that is she suffered from a degenerative muscle disorder. For many years, people thought she had polio, but essentially her legs, she couldn't walk. She was essentially told that she would have to use a wheelchair for the rest of her life, but she didn't want to do that. So she essentially pulled herself around her property, just using her arms. And look at how incredible these arms are. Like they look so frail to me, but knowing how she lived her life, they were very powerful arms. So here we see a woman who is like lunging in this tall grass here, looking up towards this house. And there is, I think, even without knowing her biography, this incredible sense of paralysis here. Andrew Wyeth, when he first painted this, he didn't really think that it was going to be a successful picture. He actually referred to it as being a flat tire. But then in other interviews, he talked about the second he put this pink paint in the foreground, he said, it almost blew me across the room. So he felt like he had found something here. So I want to emphasize how unusual this picture was in the fine art world at this time. 1948, Jackson Pollock was already making splatter paintings. That was the talk of the town. If you wanted to be an artist who was recognized, you're working in abstract expressionism. You're not working in realism, and you're not painting scenes of like a rural American life. This seemed pretty backwards in comparison to what was happening in the art world. Now, the Christina's World was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art. Andrew Wyeth was just 31 years old. He was paid $1,800 for the picture, and that's like the equivalent of about $15,000 today, which is a nice haul for a single picture. So sort of like his father, who was doing really well around the age of 30 with his pictures for Treasure Island. This is a picture that really helped to cement his career. And of course, it has become part of American pop culture. You can go on Instagram if you're inclined to do such a thing and see all of these young women who have gone up to Maine and sought out this same landscape just to recreate it and lie in that same field. I love these pictures only for the fact that you see the artistic license that Andrew Wyeth took with the landscape here, sort of separating out these buildings, creating that great sort of tension between the top of those buildings and the edge of the picture frame, creating this great sort of swooping line here. And again, some car tracks over here. So there's a lot of wonderful things that are happening in this picture. Andrew Wyeth would probably say that without Christina in this picture, there's so much about the grass and the way that the grass is painted here that is a lot like what Jackson Pollock was doing at the time. So he was dabbling in something that was just, you know, just a little bit different from realism, but in the end, he sort of anchored this picture with something that's very recognizable. Now, this farm, this structure here today, still exists, and it is a national landmark. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2011, and I believe it is the only building, basically, that's ever been added to that list, because it was a part of a painting. So now it's operated by the Farnsworth Museum, who has banked quite a bit on Wyeth tourism. So you can go up and see this house seasonally and sprawl across the grounds and take your own picture for Instagram if you're so inclined. So the Farnsworth Museum actually purchased this work by Andrew Wyeth in 1964. This is a picture called Her Room. It's a painting, it's essentially a portrait of his wife that's just told in the objects that she collected and created. She created these pale pink curtains and would assemble, you know, little shells in ascending order of size. And so there's just these references to her kind of lovingly included in what is, again, this kind of muted landscape with the muted color palette here. The Farnsworth paid $65,000 for this painting in '64, and that was at the time the highest price ever paid by a museum for a work by a living artist. So once again, Andrew Wyeth is doing very well for himself. Before we leave these muted interiors, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't show you this picture of the master bedroom from the following year. Who doesn't? I mean, if you love dogs, you love this picture. And even if you hate dogs for sleeping on your furniture, you still love this picture. There's something about this dog cuddled up on the bed here that is just pulls at the heartstrings. It's a great picture. So I'm going to fast forward in time in Andrew Wyeth's career to the year 1986. And that is the year that Andrew Wyeth makes a huge publicity splash in American culture, because we can see that his works are featured on the cover of Time and Newsweek simultaneously. And no other artist in history had ever achieved this. If you remember back, Time and Newsweek were the big thing. So Picasso had never achieved this. And actually, it was an honor, like at that point, that was really only reserved for like presidents, really, people, other prestigious people in political life in their prime. So there was huge media hype over the woman who was featured in these works. Essentially what had happened was there was like a huge cache of about 250 paintings and drawings that had just been discovered after 15 years. Of course, Wyeth is still alive and kicking at this point. But these pictures all featured this one woman named Helga. And so they were all snatched up and purchased all together in one lot, which created a huge sensation. And the sensationalism was sort of added to exponentially by an early interview with Andrew Wyatt's wife, when the interviewer asked her, "What are these pictures of Helga really about?" And his wife sort of gulped and said, "These are about love." So sensational all over the place. People began to posit basically that the Helga was his mistress. And the pictures feature her, sometimes clothed, sometimes unclothed, and she's, beautiful. She's striking. This is called Daydream over here from 1980. This one's called Lovers from 1981. Well, as it turns out, it was just hype. He wasn't, as far as I know, having an affair with Helga. He just created really gorgeous pictures that were presented in a very salacious way. So years later, he was interviewed about the Helga pictures, and the interviewer asked, "Is Helga going to be at your 90th birthday party?" And he said, "Yeah, certainly. Oh, absolutely. She's part of the family now. I know it shocks everyone. That's what I really love about it. It really shocks them." And Helga actually went on to kind of take care of him in his old age. But these are just really gorgeous and like amazingly painted images. This is a picture called Braids. This is from 1977. This is just the detail over here, so you can see every single wisp of hair, but the realism in the face and in the sweater and in those, the plaited hair here is just so stunning. It's just really beautiful. And so his Helga paintings were exhibited in 1987 at the National Gallery of Art, and that was the first time the National Gallery of Art exhibited works by a living artist. So Andrew Wyeth was doing something right. Here's a photograph of him of receiving the National Medal of Arts in 2007. So this was just a couple of years before he died. And like I said, he received so many honors and awards during his lifetime that there's just not enough time to cover all of it here. I had mentioned before too that one of his biggest regrets was that he didn't paint a portrait of his father before his father's death. So he was sure to paint portraits of his children. This is his son, Nicholas Wyeth, who would grow up to be an art dealer. And this is his youngest son, Jamie Wyeth, in a picture called Far Away from 1952. So Jamie Wyeth was the baby, Andrew Wyeth was the baby, and there is a father-son bond there that he is nurtured into another great artistic career. One art historian referred to Jamie Wyeth as being born with a silver paintbrush in his mouth, or possibly his hand. But essentially, Jamie Wyeth is set up for success in a way that few other artists have ever been set up for success. So his father is very well known. His his grandfather is very well known. His father is a super success who's very well connected in the art world, and Jamie Wyeth gets born into this incredible position. So here we have Jamie Wyeth in a few photographs here. This is him with his father over here. You might recognize the picture above them. And this is his aunt, Carolyn, who helped to train him as an artist. He received training from his own father, very similar to the kind of training that Andrew Wyeth received from N.C. Wyeth. And at a very early age, Jamie Wyeth showed incredible promise. He had these incredible advantages too. His father connected him to like the cultural elite of New York City as a teenager. When Jamie Wyeth wanted to study anatomy, his father connected him actually to the city morgue in New York City so he could go and learn about anatomy. And these are, you know, opportunities that aren't afforded to every 19-year-old out there. So he's got all these advantages, but on top of that, Jamie Wyeth was a painting prodigy. This was his first real kind of masterwork. He was 17 years old when he painted this. This is called Portrait of Shorty from 1963. Look at the way this face has been painted here. Shorty was a man who lived around Chadds Ford. He was essentially like a day laborer, a hermit, somebody who people didn't really know that well. But of course, he's got this very interesting face that seems to tell the whole story of a tough and isolated existence. We see the chin that has this beard stubble here. We see, you know, the heavy pockets under his eyes, the wrinkles around his eyes. It's just really striking. The wrinkles around his neck, and then you know, this undershirt that sort of speaks to, you know, his position in life, and all of this is contrasted against this incredible wingback chair, and again, this chair has this kind of swooping silhouette to it that creates this incredible tension and dialogue with the edge of the picture, which I think is sort of inherited from the way his father and perhaps even his grandfather painted. So, Jamie Wyeth, I believe, is painting primarily in oils, unlike his father. And because of this incredible circumstance that he's born into, he has the opportunity to paint another important picture at a very young age. This is 1965, just 2 years later, so he's not even 20 yet. And this is his portrait of Lincoln Edward Kirstein, who was a huge mover and shaker in New York City, the co-founder of the New York City Ballet and its managing director for more than 40 years. So a great picture, a really sort of unusual pose and composition. Kirsten thought it was just so fantastic. He compared it to John Singer Sargent after it was painted. Right around the early age of 20, Jamie Wyeth is offered the opportunity to paint the official White House portrait of JFK. And this is just a few years after JFK's assassination. And it was Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy that approached young Jamie Wyeth for this commission. Now, Jamie Wyeth actually turned down this opportunity to paint the official portrait, but he still wanted to paint a portrait. And he spent months studying JFK's images, videos of him. He even traveled on campaign trails with Robert Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy to really just sort of etch in his mind what the Kennedys looked like and how they moved. And the result is this really remarkable portrait of John F. Kennedy from just a few years after the assassination. This was a picture that Jamie Kennedy kept in his collection for many years. It's a bit ambiguous. You can't really tell if JFK is listening, if he's contemplating, if he's about to speak. But what I love here is that his body sort of seems at rest, at ease. He's sort of lounging, leaning, but his mind seems very much engaged with something. So this picture was was purchased by the Museum of Fine Arts and sort of at the center of a retrospective of Wyatt's work back in 2014. And you can imagine that, you know, the MFA would love to have something about JFK painted by a New England artist. So interestingly, the Biden White House has requested this picture for loan, and I believe it hangs in a private study just outside of the Oval Office for the president to think about. An interesting choice. So Jamie Wyeth develops a sort of a quirky sense of humor that you have the privilege of developing when you're positioned professionally the way he has been. So he was asked by the National Academy of Design in order to receive full acceptance as a member of the National Academy of Design. He was asked to create a self-portrait. And in 1972, this is the self-portrait he submitted, which they fully rejected. But this speaks to his playful nature. And actually, he did attend a few family functions around this time of year wearing a pumpkin on his head. But he was just being playful, of course. And in the end, he submitted a self-portrait that looked more like this and then received full entry into the National Academy of Design. In 1968, he was married, and his wife, Phyllis, has sort of like an interesting connection to this whole sort of family story. His wife, Phyllis, was a lifelong equestrian, and she had broken her neck in a car accident just a few years before she was married to Wyatt. So she was unable to walk, sort of like Christina Olsen, but she could, she did have, she did make use of crutches, and I think later on a scooter. But it's sort of interesting how this attachment to a woman with this kind of disability sort of filtered down through the next generation. And the word attachment is right here because Andrew Wyeth, his father, said, you know, when I die, I want to be buried next to Christina. And he was, in fact, buried in the same cemetery. So it's interesting that his son sort of has like a similar story in some ways. This is a picture that he created of his wife called "And Then Deep into the Gorge" from 1975. There's a funny story of an art historian interviewing Jamie Wyeth about this picture, and then later his wife about this picture. And Jamie Wyeth is talking about how, you know, the horses function as her legs here and, you know, give her mobility. And then they interview his wife, and she's just like, why did he have to paint such a low cut shirt? That just speaks to, you know, they're very different perspectives here. So Jamie Wyeth's quirky sense of humor comes out in other ways. He creates a lot of sort of funny pictures of animals. This is called Portrait of a Lady from 1968. This is called Portrait of a Pig from 1971. Now, this is an artist who has essentially the chops, the bona fides to be painting celebrity portraits. He could be the John Singer Sargent of the 20th century, and instead he's painting big fat hogs. It's almost as though he's thumbing his nose at the art world. Here's another great animal painting that he created called Islander from 1975. There's a whole great story behind this work about how this ram basically took over this island, and he had to slowly befriend it over several weeks in order to be able to paint this picture. But I mean, you can just appreciate, I mean, not only the landscape, but the way he's painted this kind of curly hair on this ram is really, it's beautiful, it's stunning. I think he took a page from his father too, in knowing that people love dog paintings. So this was his friend's dog, Kleberg, who he used mustache tint or dye to create this little ring around his eye. And in this picture that dates to 1984, he puts Kleberg next to this beehive and surrounds him or puts in the background all of these texts that his grandfather had illustrated. So it's a little bit of his life story in this picture. And, you know, this really funny expression from the dog here that everybody has always loved. Years later, he paints Kleberg again with a more kind of expressionistic style. And this is called squirreling. So you really get the sense of the joy from the dog here. And I think that once again, he's sort of thinking about the way his father sort of captured the best of a dog in the master bedroom picture over here. So we'll wrap up on Jamie Wyeth, thinking about this notion of celebrity too, because he and Andy Warhol decided that they would exchange portraits of each other, which, you know, in the art world is really sort of like consecrating each other. Andy Warhol was all about celebrity. Jamie Wyeth is from, you know, this famous artistic family. So this partnership just crystallized everything for both of them. This is an early sketch of Andy Warhol. This is the final painting, a frontal depiction of him and his dog. It's really stark. It's unglamorous in every way. It's like showing Andy Warhol, warts and all, and he was so sort of famously self-conscious about his appearance that you can imagine that he might not have loved the final outcome here because he made Jamie Wyeth look like a real heartthrob, and he made Jamie Wyeth look, you know, like the celebrities that he was silk screening. He's a Mick Jagger here. He's a romantic hero. But, you know, once again, just the fact that they were doing these portraits of each other really helped to cement their careers at this point too. So we will wrap up. We've run out of time. We'll wrap up with just, drawing this thread between these three generations once again. And because it's October, let's do it with pumpkins. We have N.C. Wyeth over here with an illustration from 1913. We've got this sense of narrative here. We've got a recognizable figure, a farmer who is conceivably, you know, picking pumpkins for sale. Over here, we have sort of a moody Andrew Wyeth tempera painting with these kind of, well, actually, this might be a watercolor now that I'm looking a little more closely, but we've got these muted tones. It's a little bit mysterious. We have this pile of white pumpkins with just a little bit of orange peeking out. And then over here, we get Jamie Wyeth's quirky sense of humor in a picture called Mischief Night from 1986, where this pumpkin has sort of taken on a life of his own and seems to be going for this little bit of a joyride. So you get Jamie Wyeth's sort of playfulness and irreverence here, but all three of these artists really did love to paint pumpkins. So that seems like the perfect place to end in the month of October. So I will end there, and I welcome any questions or comments anybody has about the Wyeth family of artists, and I will start going through these chats here too.